In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Hello, my dear unknown friends. I'm Ignotus Amicus, and welcome back to my channel. Coming from a hotel today, on the eve of Epiphany, here in this part of America, we are bracing for a massive snowstorm. And so I am here at just a cheap hotel near where I work, so that I can get to and from work over the next few days. Where I live normally is deep in rural areas where the roads are treated last, and here in technically the American South, the back roads are always the last to be treated. So where I am, I'm just not even 5 minutes up the road from my current place of employment. So today, we're going. Oh, I should also mention it's very cold. It's very cold today. The snow is about to hit us any minute now. I will be pleasantly surprised if I wake up in the morning and there is nothing, in which case I will avail myself of the peace and quiet whenever I get off of work to continue my writing and researching. I brought some materials with me, and one of them I am going to review today. It's been a while since, maybe it's been about 2-3 months since my last book review. The last one being a rather unfortunate book on that styles itself as a biography of Valentin Tomberg, but alas has some very problematic, has a problematic agenda behind it, and thus approaches the subject of Tomberg's life in a very biased, from a very biased standpoint. So today we're going to review something else, something more edifying, that apparently has caused a bit of a stir up. Apparently, this particular book has been hailed by some and derided by others. And that book is Mysticism, Magic, and Monasteries, Recovering the Sacred Mystery at the Heart of Reality by Sebastian Morello. Sebastian is a contributor of the European Conservative. I believe he has his own blog. I don't normally read blogs, and albeit though I am on Substack, I can't say that I read very much on Substack, only because it's on my phone, and my little toe dips on every day or every other day in on social media is enough, is more than enough time spent on my phone than I would care to spend. I do have a mind of picking up one of those pocket e-readers that I have seen. I very much like that idea, especially if it's an Android-based device. Then I could download Substack and comfortably read. I stare at computers all day when I'm at work, and so the less screen time I have, the better for my eyes. for my sleep. And obviously, the less time I spend doom scrolling, which is something that I've tried to avoid as much as I can, and which is touched on in this book. But anyhow, so Sebastian Morello, he's very well, a very well researched, a very well practiced philosopher and theologian and political commentator. His series on the European Conservatives YouTube channel, known as Symposia, is a fantastic series. His latest episodes involve the Afrikaners and the relationship between man and nature, and how that is currently being embodied in South Africa. Very, a very interesting sort of peek behind the curtains of what is happening in Africa that isn't being talked about very often, and its relation to greater spiritual matters ultimately, if not those more of a more philosophical variety as well. He also wrote, I also reviewed a book previous that he had written, which was The World is God's Icon, which was an exploration uh, of the Neoplatonic expression in St. Thomas Aquinas that he felt a lot of people pass up on or outright ignore to their own detriment. And as I have said in that review, I am entirely in Sebastian's debt for helping rehabilitate my appreciation and and respect for Thomas Aquinas and what it exactly was that he did. And that book is tremendously important, and anybody, any Thomist worth their salt, it should be required reading. And if they refuse to, then I would I would refuse to bother with anything more that such a Thomist would share with us. Now, the book primarily, I would say, is a diagnosis. This book is a diagnosis of Catholicism and the West in light of modernity, what he calls an anti-liturgical hex. And he traces it back, as does Wolfgang Smith, to René Descartes, who, by the way, as he points out, was schooled by Jesuits. And while I may vehemently disagree with Steiner and the anthroposophists on many things, I at least share their disdain for the Jesuits, especially the Jesuits a century after the passing of Ignatius himself. Now, Sebastian is a little more severe against Ignatius of Loyola, and he traces the beginnings of Cartesianism within the post-Ignatian Jesuit order. So, the reason being is that there's something inherent to Ignatian spirituality that seems to be a sort of like a proto bifurcation of the mind, where you are separating your lived embodied experience with what is occurring in your heart and keeping them separated. Now, this may be a gross misrepresentation, and anybody who is more versed in Ignatian spirituality than myself or Mr. Morello, I happily urge you to kindly and in good faith um, explain to us whether whether we have it wrong. But given that Descartes was schooled by Jesuits, um, it stands to reason that their influence certainly had a hand in what we later know as Cartesianism, um, the sort of disintegration of the subjective self with objective reality, and that they are mutually exclusive to each other and do not correspond with each other. So, throughout portions of this book, Sebastian sort of looks at various aspects of the Catholic faith and man's relationship with nature, and shows where this Cartesian bifurcation has ravaged our sense of self, our identity, our spirituality, and our relationship with the divine. Now, I think this is all incredibly important. And while he offers many important and necessary analyses of things that are drastically going awry, um, there are a few suggestions for solutions to combat certain aspects of it. One of them he cites is that Rod Dreher doesn't go far enough with the Benedict option, um, if Christendom is to be restored in any sense, that that Catholicism must rekindle its monastic roots. It needs to become Benedictine again, hence the monasteries of the title. Now, the mysticism and the magic is where the book provides controversy between two very entrenched camps of traditional Catholicism. On the one hand, you have the self-ascribed ultramontanists, or one you could also say hyper-papalists, and on the other, you have more prudential and a more prudential and a more embodied and temperate traditional Catholicism that um, well, so in the camp of the often the hyperpapalists or the ultramontanists, um, of the traditional variety, they it's a very precarious position that they're in, because on the one hand, to be ultramontanist means to wholly accept anything that comes out of the mouth of the Pope, practically speaking, and even actual church teaching tells us that it's popes can err unless speaking ex cathedra and in other various and very prescriptive circumstances. Um, Unfortunately, the majority of the time, some of the more recent popes of recent memory, some of these traditional ultramontanists sort of shrug their shoulders and wave their hand, and it's like, well, they're post John 23rd and onward, it's downhill modernism from there, so anything before that is a-okay. And Pius the 12th said this, Pius the 11th said this, Pius the 10th said this, so on and so forth. And there is certainly nothing wrong with an appeal to all popes through all of history, because the deposit of faith stands so long as a pope does not speak error. But that's for a different conversation. The other camp is more, so the first camp, the ultramontanists, they are, uh, and they're described in Sebastian's book, they are, they have intellectualized the faith. They've turned the faith into a set of propositions that one either ascribes to or does not. Now, in one sense, there certainly is we certainly have the creed. We certainly have the Athanasian Creed, which the Athanasian Creed certainly speaks truth to what is the bare minimum that we are required to believe to be faithful, baptized Catholics. And but that's not when Morello refers to the proposition-based Catholicism, he's not referring to anything akin to the Athanasian Creed. He's referring to a type of, or a vein of Catholicism that is primarily based as an internet genre. It's that it seems to thrive online and in forums where the like, or places like X or Facebook, and in such places you can't actually have a true embodied interaction with fellow Christians. You are having this virtual conversation. You're having a textual relationship with people. And because of this, there's a tendency to then rely on textual sources, which is all well and good and has its place. But the citation of sources is not the embodiment of the faith. The assent to propositions is not an embodiment. And he argues that this approach to Catholicism is it suffers from Cartesianism. It suffers from the bifurcation of res existence and res cogitans, between the mind, the subjective self and the external world. And so this hyper intellectual Catholicism that only exists on the internet, and its subsistence relies upon the internet, that this is not what Catholicism is supposed to be. That's his diagnosis. That on the one hand you have the um, for lack of a better term, the Vatican II simps, um, who only refer to Vatican II documents as if it was like, as if it's like the only council that exists. Then you have the hyperpapalists, which hinge upon every word that comes out of a pope's mouth, whether it's Francis, Benedict, John Paul II. Or you have your sort of hyper-feminist, militant Novus Ordo types, like your Susans of the Parish Council. There's that camp, and it's a camp that is slowly fading into obscurity as more and more of millennials and Gen Zs begin to embrace tradition. In fact, where my family attends Mass, it's at a seminary that it's it's a Latin mass only seminary, a traditional seminary, and there's maybe 120 seminarians. There are more seminarians than there are pews in the choir. And for Sunday High Mass, they have to vacate the congressional pews that they've taken up in order to allow uh, as much of the laity as can be squeezed in. And occasionally, there's so much space. There's so many pews taken up. They have to squeeze all the single guys and bachelors in the very back of the choir behind the seminarians, and then everyone else is left for like standing room only. So anyhow, that's a huge aside to try to bring it back on track. Um, so yeah, so you have your Cartesian trad Catholics who rely on propositional logic, or they rely on uh, Catholicism being a propositional religion, and then you have folks more akin to, say, Robert Nugent or Roger Buck or uh, or I'd say Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, um, just as examples of individuals who, or at least individuals in the public eye, who are incredibly concerned with the embodiment of the faith, the living out the faith, of taking, of not relying solely upon propositional logic, of not solely relying on propositional Catholicism in order to be Catholic. Um, so I found that to be a very interesting bifurcation that he identified within the traditional Catholic community at large. And I certainly have seen it and have certainly interacted with it um, in its den, so to speak, uh, on the internet, where it thrives the most. And it is certainly a rather it is a very soul crushing beast that that um, suffers from incredible assumptions um, about, not just about the teachings of the faith, but even the history of the church, and not just the history generally speaking, but the history and biography of particular people, of saints who, by their very lives and testimony, um, show a Catholicism quite opposed to what they think Catholicism is. And I think therein lies the first sort of pang to the conscience of those who have difficulty with this book. And probably one of the first reasons why there's a controversy about it on the internet as is. The second point that drives um, the propositional Catholics mad is he talks about magic. And specifically, he talks about Hermeticism and Christian Hermeticism. He uh, he even cites Saint Hildegard von Bingen and various studies and research that has been done on the corpus of Saint Albertus Magnus. Um, and he even touches upon Trithemius of Spanheim. So, understandably, the propositional types are going to immediately have a knee-jerk reaction to all of that. And their first thought is going to be, well, he's advocating for the occult. He's advocating for Gnosticism and pantheism. And I honestly am beginning to wonder if these individuals who are throwing such a stink about this book, I feel like they haven't read the book. And if they have read the book, they weren't even listening to what was being said and were reading it in bad faith. Kind of like when you go onto Netflix and you watch a terribly bad remake of a Hallmark movie just because for the enjoyment of hating on it. They call it hate watching. It's uh, for those blowing a stink about this book that have read it. I feel like that's what they're doing. They're not even uh, they're not even giving themselves the opportunity to comprehend what it is that they're reading. Because if they actually comprehended what they're reading, or gee, I don't know, if they reached out to Sebastian and asked him questions about what he had written, then that would be better than just spewing calumny on X. It boggles my mind. And to be fair to them, I understand their concern as it regards the occult, and I think they need to take a moment to actually read the book and assess it fairly, um, and to maybe take a moment to revisit their um, revisit their understanding of the propositions that they hold, not out of a sense of wanting them to apostatize or to fully embrace, the occultism of, say, Aleister Crowley or anything like that, but to understand that uh, there have been that there are saints and doctors of the church that have contemplated the depth of meaning within creation and that is present in creation in order to better understand God and to better embody the faith. Um, and a lot of people take issue with bringing up terms like hermeticism, and the word gnosis and the propositional types. They one utterance of the word gnosis and their their uh, their knee jerks so hard that they could launch a rocket, um, when it's incredibly unnecessary. It's unnecessary and it's imprudent and um, if anything, it's a manifestation of a type of pride. It's a manifestation of pride, um, and I would argue it's the same. It's the same pride that Luther embodied when he supposedly nailed his 95 Theses to the door. Scare quotes on supposedly. So let me see here. To help set aside any difficulty with Sebastian's use of the word Hermeticism, um, we'll go directly to the source, and I'll read it for you here. How he defines Hermeticism. Okay, it's on page 71. You can look it up yourself if you don't believe me. Quote, what I mean by Hermetic is a set of practices and disciplines of mind, will, and imagination that habituate the practitioner to a vision of the world that acknowledges it as God's icon. All right. Now, what he doesn't, he's not referring to sex magic. He's not referring to Thelema. He's not referring to Wicca or the New Age. Um, he seems to have a very um, he certainly has, to me, a sober interpretation. Maybe I think he errs more on the prudential side, or the temperate side, in interpreting what Valentin Tomberg means by hermetic, what Hermeticism is. And he quotes a few passages from Tomberg to help illustrate his point. Um, I'm going to suspend sharing my judgments about that for my essay that I am working on, which will be published on Substack, which you can find at the Sophiergist. I'll try to include a link to the Substack in the description so that you can go there when it is published and subscribe if you would like to. So if we go with, and he also sort of compares Hermeticism as like an equivalent to alternative medicine. It's like it's the alternative medicine to science and philosophy at large, and which normally creates a very wide gambit. So yes, he certainly has his own spin to Tomberg's conception of what Christian Hermeticism is. And it's certainly not a bad interpretation. It's definitely a very temperate one, and I don't take issue with it. I think that it. I think that it should go a little bit further than it does, but it's certainly useful to help ease people into what is Christian Hermeticism, why is it important, and especially how one practices it, and obviously its relation to Catholicism, which I notice the chapters that he has in here related to Hermeticism and the Magi are actually just are re-edited versions of 3 essays that he wrote. I can't remember if it's on his blog or if it was with the European Conservative. The title of the 3-part essay was "Can Hermetic Magic Save the Church?" or something like that. So yeah, I thought that was the way that he adapted those essays into this book and integrated the themes into the whole of this book, I think is very well done, and it doesn't feel jarring at all. But again, back to the subject of that particular point. Um, he, if we look at how he conceives of what Hermeticism is, that it's a practice of acknowledging creation as God's icon. What he's doing there in that particular passage, he's tying it into his previous book, on Thomas Aquinas and the Neoplatonism of Thomas Aquinas, which is certainly there. Uh, the participation metaphysics, the practice of participation metaphysics. That's what he is defining Hermeticism to be. Um, and again, I think it's a very useful definition. Um, I don't know if it's fully accurate, and we shall see once I can finish my essay, uh, which I'm about halfway through it, I believe. Um, I do think that it's not as broad as that, but uh, or as broad as Morello would have it. But do think, uh, I do think that it is that his conception of Hermeticism is very useful. Certainly nothing untoward about it. There are passages in this book where he relates some of the manuscripts that are attributed to someone else, but are more than likely written under a pseudonym by Trithemius of Spanheim, who, as it so happens, is the father of modern cryptography, uh, and is also known for the Steganographia, which I haven't had the chance to read through yet, in order to evaluate um, whether it's up to snuff, so to speak, sophurgically. But he mentions a treatise on sort of dream incubation, and mentions how it was not an uncommon practice in the early church to um, to after mass to sort of nap after if one partook of communion, in order to um, in order to commune further. And in all honesty, it certainly is. There's certainly a biblical precedent um, for God and angels to speak to us through our dreams, as it is for demons to do so as well. But for those who practice the discernment of spirits, uh, then it's for those who are very adept at such a practice, dream incubation shouldn't pose much of an issue. But again, um, it may be one of the few good things have that came out of that came from Saint Ignatius, is sort of the discernment, uh, the discernment of spirits, as laid out in his treatise on the subject. Elsewhere in Morello's book, he um, he talks about egregores and what he thinks egregores are. He also sort of summarizes the issue of clericalism that is rampant in the church right now, where priests and bishops behave more like corporate managers than they do shepherds of souls. And his solution to that is um, is a revitalization of monasticism, specifically Benedictine. And uh, I can I can agree to that. I can agree with that to an extent. Sadly, sadly, there aren't very many uh, there aren't many places like that anymore, and hopefully that can change. And it certainly must. I agree with Sebastian that without monasticism, where um, Christendom will never recover. It'll never come back into vogue, which it should and desperately needs to. Um, and then one of my one of my favorite chapters actually is the final chapter about training like a Templar knight. And I really appreciated this because, the rest of the book is sort of is rather heady. Um, it does suffer. Not that it. I should rephrase that. It doesn't suffer necessarily from anything, to my mind, but it definitely diagnoses much of the mental and spiritual maladies that are afflicting us. But it saves the very last chapter for sort of a a lovely little personal essay um, about getting back into shape the way that our ancestors of Christendom would have gotten themselves into shape, and cites a passage about a certain French knight in the late 14th century who trained by swinging axes around. And he talks about how he uses a gada, or a steel mace bar, or and how he swings it around in his yard and everything to kind of keep fit. And it's a very ancient practice of exercise. And what's really odd, from a personal standpoint, is right before I got my hands on this book, I had started practicing historical European martial arts and found a local group that meets twice a week, and had started going to every day that they would have it. And no sooner am I 5 sessions in to HEMA that I find myself finally getting to the chapter on training like a Knights Templar. And I kind of took that as sort of a providential confirmation that I am on the right track for something. Um, but ultimately, the if I could summarize this book, I would say it is a diagnosis of what is wrong with the world today, specifically what's wrong with the church today, and specifically what's wrong with our relationship, our relationship with the faith and with God and with God's creation. And he proposes his solution for each, and each of them correspond to three um, sort of three equal but separate, or it's like a tripartite schema. So there's the mysticism, there's the embodiment, and then there's the intellectual. And in order to be in order to fully embody the faith, you have to have all three of these. You can't, none of them can be atrophied in any way whatsoever. The propositional Catholics, the ultramontanist, propositional based trad Catholics, they are all mind. They're all ratio, at the exclusion, almost to the exclusion of the mysticism and the physicality that is demanded of fully embodying the faith. And so you have to be temperate in all three spheres. And this just, to me, echoes Meditations on the Tarot, where Tomberg is expounding upon how Christian Hermeticism serves the, or it is, what is it? It is, there's a brief sort of soft definition that Tomberg gives where he defines Hermeticism or Christian Hermeticism as the, sadly I'm using my notebook to kind of prop the laptop up a little bit for the purpose of camera angle, so I have it written down, but it's akin to him saying that Christian Hermeticism is the whole of traditional mysticism, gnosis, and magic. And obviously, what he means by magic is not at all what Blavatsky had in mind, or what Mathers had in mind, or what Eliphas Levi had in mind. And Tomberg is kind enough to provide us a definition, and that there are three types. You have sacred magic, personal magic, and sorcery. Sacred magic is God's will be done. Personal magic is my will be done. And sorcery is the will of some unknown entity that is likely demonic be done. And that it'll trick you into thinking that you're doing your own will. And so when Tomberg says mysticism, gnosis, and magic, the magic he is referring to is sacred magic, doing the will of God. The gnosis that Tomberg is referring to is not the gnosis of the heretical Gnostics, because what Tomberg advocates for and what Sebastian advocates for in this book is the exact opposite of what the Gnostics were up to. The Gnostics were into actually, it could be said, the Gnostics were the proto-Cartesians. They believed that all matter was poison to the soul, and that the soul is the only thing that mattered, that the body was trapped, or that the soul was trapped in the body, that we were piloting a meat machine, and that's all it was good for. And obviously, that is not something that Tomberg nor Sebastian ascribes to. So for the propositional Catholics out there, to say that Sebastian is promoting Gnosticism, you clearly have just not read the book. Like, honestly, like if you don't want to give money to him, at least find a PDF of it somewhere. So you can actually read what he says. He critiques Gnosticism. The gnosis that Sebastian and Tomberg talk about is the gnosis that Clement of Alexandria talks about. And last I looked, Clement of Alexandria is considered a father of the church and a saint. So I'm going to go with Clement's definition of gnosis. Just simply, it's just knowledge. It's knowledge of what? It's knowledge of God. And you can't come to knowledge of God by knowledge alone. You have to have it's part of it is grace, and the grace comes through the mysticism, and the faithfulness to the grace comes through the magic, through the embodiment and the manifestation and the expression of the mysticism and the gnosis. And the mysticism is an expression of the embodiment and the knowledge. It's tripartite. It is a reflection of the Trinity. And we are we not called to fully embody the truth of the Gospels? That's what Sebastian is advocating in this book. That's it. That's all he is advocating for. So all I can say is this is another fantastic piece by Sebastian. Tremendously grateful for it. There were times I was reading this and I wept. I teared up, and I teared up because I could even see with even the littlest things in my life, I was able to almost instantly recognize the egregores. It's like all of a sudden they were coming out of the woodwork. And no, I'm not saying that I was actually seeing anything. Like I wasn't seeing drooping faces pouring out of the walls and out of the shadows in the corners or anything like that. No. It's much subtler than that, as is true of spiritual matters. But I cannot recommend this book enough. And don't let the controversy surrounding its publication deter you from reading it. There's so much wisdom in this book. It's more of a diagnosis with sort of a peek at probable solutions, but I would just argue it is a continuation of Valentin Tomberg's project that he started, which is a restoration of the embodiment of the faith. Because Tomberg recognized that the world was suffering from a Cartesianism, and that there were and are many who would fall prey to the allure of Gnosticism, whether it shows itself in things like the occult or the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn, or the Rosicrucians, or the Martinists, or the modern day alchemists, or the Freemasons. He saw he saw where that road led, and had been on that road himself, and yet was still able to find his way to the traditional Catholic Church. So do not um, do not prevent yourself due to your peers in picking up a copy of this book and reading it for yourself. The title, don't it don't let the title be the end all of an argument, either for or against it. It's more the subtitle. The subtitle is probably more important. We're talking about the recovery of the heart of reality. And what's at the heart of reality? Christ. Jesus Christ is the heart of reality. The Logos. The Incarnation. Catholicism is incarnational. It is not propositional. And anybody who tells you different, I would question associating with them until you can get yourself educated, and so that you have time to discern things. So don't spend so much time on social media being a keyboard warrior, though I am far from perfect in that regard. Far from perfect in that regard myself. And hence, it is one of the egregores with which I have to wrestle. So, but no, do not put off reading this book. Please read this book. This book is so important. It's so important. And I would love to pick Sebastian's brain if I could. I don't know if he watches, but I know someone at the European Conservative follows me on X. I don't know if they watch my videos or not, but if it were ever at all possible that I could have a conversation and again, to pick Sebastian's brain, I'd be eternally grateful for the opportunity, and I pray that it may someday come to pass, either here for the benefit of everyone who views my channel, or in private. I am open to either, whichever the good Lord wills. So avail yourself of this book, Mysticism, Magic, and Monasteries by Sebastian Morello. 2 thumbs up. We'll conclude with prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Peace be with you, and God bless, my dear unknown friends.